The race to Messina, Patton's lightning strikes Sicily, summer 1943. They told General George Patton to sit still and guard the British flank. Instead, he captured a city 100 miles away in 72 hours, a city he was never supposed to attack. Then he did something no one had tried before. Loaded his troops onto Navy ships and leapfrogged them behind German lines, again and again, turning the Mediterranean itself into a weapon. The Germans couldn't stop him. The British couldn't catch him. By the time it was over, Patton had proven American forces were the fastest, most aggressive army in the world. This is the story of the race to Messina, where one general's refusal to play second fiddle changed modern warfare forever. The waiting game, July 10, 1943. The Mediterranean sun hammered down on the deck of USS Monrovia, anchored off the southern coast of Sicily. Major General George Smith Patton, Jr. stood at the railing, his polished helmet catching the light, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips. Below, landing craft churned white foam, carrying the men of his 7th Army toward the beaches. Salt spray mixed with diesel fumes. The distant crump of naval bombardment rolled across the water like summer thunder. Patton's jaw worked beneath his thin lips. In his breast pocket lay the operational orders, crisp paper that felt like a death sentence to his ambitions. Protect Montgomery's flank. 4 words that reduced him to a supporting actor in someone else's drama. 58 years old, a lifetime of preparation, and they wanted him to be a bodyguard. The invasion of Sicily, Operation Husky, represented the Allies' first major thrust into Hitler's fortress Europe. 460,000 men, 2,700 ships, 14,000 vehicles. The largest amphibious assault in history, dwarfing even the raids on North Africa. British Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery commanded the 8th Army, assigned the eastern route straight up the coast to Messina, the strategic port city that controlled the narrow strait to mainland Italy. Capture Messina, and you controlled the gateway to Europe. Patton's 7th Army received a different assignment. Land on the southern beaches, secure Montgomery's left side, and wait. Stay put. Don't cause trouble. Let the British veterans handle the real fighting. The dismissal burned like acid in Patton's throat. He'd spent months in North Africa proving American soldiers could fight, bloodying them at Kasserine Pass, rebuilding them into a force that Germans respected and feared. Now the British, the same British who'd been pushed off the continent at Dunkirk, were treating his army like untested recruits who needed supervision. Patton lit a cigar. The smoke curled upward into the Mediterranean evening. Somewhere in his mind, a different plan was already taking shape, one that didn't involve waiting for anyone's permission. The map and the trap. The war room aboard Monrovia smelled of sweat, coffee, and mimeograph ink. Maps covered every surface. Sicily's boot-shaped profile marked with colored pins, elevation lines, suspected German positions. Staff officers hunched over tables, plotting supply routes, calculating logistics, coordinating with Navy liaison officers who reported on naval gunfire support. Patton stood before the largest map, studying the island's geography with the intensity of a poker player reading his opponent's faces. Sicily measured roughly 170 miles east to west, 90 miles north to south. Mountains dominated the interior, rugged volcanic terrain that favored defense. 2 coastal roads offered the only practical routes for mechanized forces, one along the eastern shore, one along the northern coast. Montgomery had claimed the eastern road. The logical choice, shortest distance to Messina, running through the major cities of Syracuse and Catania. British military doctrine emphasized methodical advance, proper preparation, set-piece battles with overwhelming firepower. Montgomery would grind northward like a steamroller, crushing German resistance through sheer weight. But Patton saw something else on that map, something the cautious British planners had missed. Sir, Colonel Hugh Gaffey, his operations officer, pointed to the western sector. We've secured the beaches. Minimal casualties. The Italians are surrendering in droves. Whole battalions giving up without a fight. What about Palermo? Patton asked, tapping the northwestern corner of the island. The city represented Sicily's capital, a major port, a psychological prize. It also sat 100 miles away from his current position, directly opposite from where he was supposed to be going. "Not in our operational zone, sir. Montgomery has the direct route to Messina. We're supposed to—" "I know what we're supposed to do, Colonel." Patton's voice carried the edge of a cavalry saber. "I'm asking what we can do." The staff officers exchanged glances. They knew that tone. It meant their general was about to do something that would either get him court-martialed or make him famous. Patton's finger traced a line across the map, west to Palermo, then east along the northern coastal road to Messina. A giant hook around the island's perimeter. Longer distance, yes. But the western sector held mostly Italian troops, demoralized and eager to quit. And the northern road, once he reached it, would bring him to Messina from the opposite direction, bypassing Montgomery's grinding advance entirely. "Get me General Alexander on the radio," Patton said quietly. General Harold Alexander commanded all Allied ground forces in Sicily, technically Patton's superior, British naturally. Polite, aristocratic, the kind of officer who believed wars should be fought according to established procedures. The radio crackled. Patton requested permission to expand his operational area, to clean up western Sicily, before resuming his flank protection duties. He made it sound routine, almost boring, just tidying up loose ends. Shouldn't take long. Alexander focused on Montgomery's advance and, not particularly concerned with American side operations, gave his consent. The paperwork would follow. Probably. Patton hung up the radio handset with the care of a man handling a loaded weapon. His staff watched him, waiting. "Gentlemen," he said, turning from the map, "we're going to take Palermo, and we're going to do it in 72 hours. Then we're going to race up the northern coast and take Messina before Montgomery gets there." He paused, letting the audacity of it sink in. "Any questions?" Silence filled the room, the kind of silence that precedes either disaster or triumph. Lightning. Across the desert. July 20th, 0530 hours. The 7th Army moved like a steel avalanche. 3 divisions, the 3rd Infantry, 2nd Armored, and 82nd Airborne, swept westward across Sicily's sun-blasted interior. Tanks churned dust that rose like biblical pillars. Half-tracks carried infantry who'd been fighting since North Africa. Lean men with hard eyes who'd learned their trade in the desert. Supply trucks stretched for miles, carrying fuel, ammunition, water, everything needed to sustain an offensive that wasn't supposed to happen. Patton drove himself up and down the advancing columns in his command jeep, appearing at unexpected moments like a vision in polished leather and starched khaki. Whenever he found traffic jams, inevitable when thousands of vehicles compete for narrow Sicilian roads, he personally directed traffic, waving trucks forward, cursing at drivers who hesitated. His presence electrified the men. They'd heard the stories, old blood and guts. A general who led from the front, who demanded speed and aggression, who believed American soldiers could outfight anyone if properly led. "Drive like hell," he shouted at tank commanders. "We're not here to dig foxholes. We're here to kill Germans and make time." The Italian defenders collapsed like wet paper. Entire regiments surrendered after token resistance. Hundreds, then thousands of Italian soldiers emerging from defensive positions with white flags, hands raised, grateful the war was over for them. Some wept with relief. Others laughed. Most just looked tired. The exhaustion of men who'd been fighting someone else's war in a cause they'd stopped believing in months ago. But scattered among the Italians were German units, the Hermann Göring Panzer Division, elements of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division. These men didn't surrender. They fought with the professional competence of soldiers who knew exactly what they were doing, setting up defensive positions, mining roads, destroying bridges as they withdrew. Every delay they imposed gave their comrades more time to escape across the Strait of Messina to the Italian mainland. The Americans pushed through. When they encountered resistance, they didn't stop to organize elaborate attacks. They called in artillery, brought up tanks, and kept moving. Speed. Momentum. The psychological weight of an army that never stopped, never hesitated, never gave the enemy time to breathe. July 22nd, 1400 hours. Patton's lead elements entered Palermo, 72 hours after starting their offensive. 100 miles covered through hostile territory. The city's Italian garrison had fled. Civilians lined the streets, waving cautiously, uncertain whether to cheer or hide. American flags appeared in windows. Someone had saved them from some earlier occupation or made them overnight. Patton stood in the city center, in the Piazza Pretoria, surrounded by Baroque architecture and his own officers. He'd captured Sicily's capital in 3 days. He'd proven American forces could move with lightning speed, and he'd done it while he was supposed to be sitting quietly on Montgomery's flank. Now came the hard part, the coastal crucible. The northern coastal road to Messina stretched 80 miles along Sicily's volcanic shore. On paper it looked simple, a single highway hugging the coast, connecting a string of small towns, villages with names that would become infamous: Santo Stefano, San Fratello, Brolo, Spadafora. In reality, it was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. The terrain alternated between sheer cliffs and steep ravines. The road clung to mountainsides with the Mediterranean on one side and volcanic rock on the other. Every few miles, a river cut through the coastal plain, requiring bridges that the Germans systematically destroyed as they withdrew. Every town offered natural defensive positions, stone buildings, narrow streets, commanding heights. And defending this hellish landscape was one of the Wehrmacht's best. The 29th Panzer Grenadier Division, backed by the Italian Assietta Division. Under the command of Colonel Ernst Günther Bade, a brilliant tactician who understood that he didn't need to win, just delay. Every day he held the Americans back was another day German forces could evacuate across the strait. Bade's soldiers fought like men who'd read the textbook on defensive warfare and then added their own annotations. They positioned artillery in the heights, commanding every inch of the coastal road. They fortified every town, turning buildings into strong points. They mined approaches, zeroed their mortars on road junctions, positioned machine gun nests in overlapping fields of fire. And when the Americans pushed them out of one position, they fell back to the next pre-prepared defensive line and did it all over again. The 7th Army's advance slowed to a crawl. Miles that should have taken hours now took days. The 3rd Infantry Division, rock-hard soldiers under Major General Lucien Truscott, led the attack, and they were bleeding. Not the catastrophic casualties of World War I. This was modern, professional combat, but steady attrition that ground down units. Men hit by artillery they never saw. Patrols ambushed in vineyards. Tanks knocked out by carefully sighted anti-tank guns. Patton fumed. He could see Messina on his maps, could practically taste victory. But the Germans were doing exactly what they'd done in North Africa, trading space for time, fighting a calculated withdrawal that preserved their force while delaying their enemies. On August 3rd, the Americans finally captured Santo Stefano after a week of fighting, 7 days to advance 5 miles. At this rate, Montgomery would reach Messina first, and Patton would arrive as a spectator to someone else's victory parade. That night, in his command post, a requisitioned villa overlooking the coast, Patton studied naval charts alongside road maps. His staff officers watched him pace, seeing the wheels turn behind those pale blue eyes. "The Navy," he said suddenly. "Get me Admiral Hewitt." The frog jumps. The concept was simple. The execution would be anything but. Instead of grinding forward along the fortified coastal road, Patton would use the Navy to leapfrog German defensive positions, load infantry onto landing craft, sail them a few miles up the coast behind German lines, land them on beaches in the enemy rear, and cut the coastal road. The Germans would have to retreat or be surrounded. Then repeat the process. Amphibious end runs, naval outflanking, frog jumps. It was audacious. It was risky. It required perfect coordination between Army and Navy, between infantry and naval gunfire support, between maps and reality. Landing craft designed for opposed beach assaults would be used for tactical maneuver. Soldiers would wade ashore not into a prepared beachhead, but into uncertain terrain, hoping the Germans hadn't anticipated the exact landing site. But it would work. It had to work. August 8th, 0300 hours. The first amphibious end run launched at St. Agatha, a town 8 miles behind German lines. 650 men from the 15th Infantry Regiment, 2 battalions, loaded into landing craft in darkness. The Mediterranean lay calm, moonless, a black mirror reflecting stars. Diesel engines rumbled. Men checked weapons one final time, that ritual soldiers had performed before combat, since spears replaced rocks. The landing craft churned through darkness, guided by Navy navigators using dead reckoning and prayer. If they missed the landing site, if they ran into German patrols, if the enemy had mined the beaches, they hit the beach at 0415. No opposition. The ramps dropped. Men splashed through surf, forming up on sand, moving inland with the speed of long practice. By dawn, they'd cut the coastal road, dug in on the heights overlooking St. Agatha, and were radioing back for artillery support. The German garrison in St. Agatha woke to find Americans behind them. They withdrew northward in haste, abandoning prepared positions, leaving equipment, racing to avoid encirclement. The American advance resumed, no longer crawling through fortified towns, but marching through evacuated positions. Patton immediately ordered a second amphibious landing, then a third. Each leap advanced his forces 5 to 10 miles up the coast, bypassing German defenses, forcing continuous retreat. The Germans couldn't prepare positions if they didn't know where the Americans would land next. They couldn't fortify every beach on Sicily's northern coast, but Baada adapted. He positioned mobile reserves ready to rush to wherever the Americans landed. He coordinated with Luftwaffe, requesting air attacks on landing craft. He turned the withdrawal into a fighting retreat, making the Americans pay for every mile. The Americans paid. The amphibious landing at Brolo on August 11th turned into a desperate fight when German counterattacks nearly overran the beachhead. For 36 hours, 650 men of the 3rd Battalion, 30th Infantry held a perimeter barely half a mile deep under constant German assault, surviving on naval gunfire that churned the earth around them. They held because failure meant death or capture, because artillery spotters on Navy destroyers put 5-inch shells danger close to American positions, because soldiers fought with the desperation of men surrounded. When relief columns finally broke through on August 12th, they found the beachhead still intact, surrounded by German dead, the survivors hollow-eyed and magnificent. The cost was real. The 7th Army suffered over 7,000 casualties in the drive to Messina, killed, wounded, missing. Not catastrophic by the standards of the war, but each number represented a man who'd left home believing in the cause, who'd crossed an ocean to fight evil, who'd paid the price for Patton's ambition and America's promise. But it worked. The Germans couldn't hold. The amphibious leaps kept them off balance, kept them retreating, denied them the time they desperately needed. And ahead, growing closer with each passing day, lay Messina. The finish line, August 17, 1943, 0930 hours. A column of American light tanks and reconnaissance vehicles rolled into Messina's outskirts. The city lay quiet in morning sun, damaged from Allied bombing but intact, its harbor still functional, its strategic position at the strait unchanged. The lead tank commander, a lieutenant from Ohio whose name history wouldn't record, radioed back to headquarters. "We're here. City's ours. No resistance." 2 hours later, Patton arrived in his command car, flanked by staff officers and trailing a cloud of journalists he'd made sure were present. He stepped out onto Messina's main square, the Piazza del Duomo, and gazed across the strait to mainland Italy. 2 miles of blue water. So close. The boot of Italy rising in hazy distance. Behind him, his soldiers secured the city. Ahead, across that narrow channel, German forces were already escaping. Barges, ferries, every vessel that could float had been pressed into service for the evacuation. Luftwaffe fighters provided air cover. German engineers had organized the retreat with typical efficiency. 100,000 German and Italian soldiers would successfully evacuate to the mainland, along with 10,000 vehicles and 50,000 tons of equipment. The Allies had won Sicily, but the enemy had preserved most of its force to fight another day. Still, victory was victory, and Patton had reached Messina first. That afternoon, British forces arrived. Montgomery's Eighth Army had ground its way up the eastern coast through fierce German resistance, fighting for every mile. They'd faced the best of the German defenders, had borne the brunt of the defensive fighting, had proven once again that British soldiers were among the finest in the world. But they'd arrived second. The meeting between Patton and Montgomery in Messina became the subject of competing narratives. Some accounts described warmth and professional respect. Others spoke of cold politeness, barely masking mutual disdain. The truth likely lay somewhere between. Two proud men representing two proud nations, meeting at the finish line of a race that only one of them had known they were running. What's certain is that Patton made sure the world knew who'd gotten there first. Photographers captured him standing in Messina's square, hands on hips, pearl-handled revolvers gleaming, looking every inch the conquering general. The images went to newspapers across America, visual proof that American forces had beaten the British to the most important objective in Sicily. The newsreels followed. Americans at home, watching in darkened theaters, saw their general accepting the surrender of an entire city, saw their flag flying over Messina, saw proof that American boys could not only fight, but win against the Wehrmacht. Echoes in history. The capture of Sicily lasted 38 days. The Allies suffered roughly 20,000 casualties, killed, wounded, missing. The Axis lost 165,000, mostly Italian prisoners who'd surrendered en masse. German casualties totaled around 32,000, but most of their force escaped across the Messina Strait intact. Strategically, Operation Husky achieved its goals. Italy would soon collapse, switching sides in September 1943. The Mediterranean supply routes were secured. Allied air power could now strike targets deep into Europe from Sicilian bases. The pressure on the Soviet Union's Eastern Front eased as German divisions transferred to defend Italy. But the operation also revealed tensions within the Allied command structure. The American-British rivalry, mostly professional and manageable, occasionally flared into genuine conflict. Patton's race to Messina highlighted these tensions even as it demonstrated American capabilities. For Patton personally, Sicily represented vindication and validation. He'd proven American forces could move with lightning speed. He'd shown that aggressive action could overcome prepared defenses. He'd demonstrated the effectiveness of combined arms warfare, tanks, infantry, artillery, naval support, all coordinated into a devastating offensive tool. His methods: the amphibious end runs, the relentless forward momentum, the rejection of cautious, methodical advance would influence American tactical doctrine for decades. Future operations in the Pacific, in Normandy, in the drive across France would bear the fingerprints of lessons learned on Sicily's rocky shores. Yet the victory came with shadows. Patton's ambition, his need to prove American superiority, his willingness to spend American lives for glory. These qualities made him effective but dangerous. Weeks after Messina, he'd slapped two soldiers suffering from combat fatigue, calling them cowards, nearly ending his career in disgrace. His diary entries revealed a man consumed with competition, often childish in his jealousies, brilliant but flawed. And the German escape rankled. For all the speed, all the aggression, all the tactical brilliance, most of the Wehrmacht forces had gotten away. Those soldiers would fight again at Salerno, at Anzio, at Monte Cassino. They'd make the Italian campaign a bloody slog, lasting 2 more years, costing hundreds of thousands of Allied casualties. The race to Messina had been won, but the prize, trapping and destroying German forces, had slipped away across that narrow strait. The weight of speed. On the evening of August 17th, after the ceremonies and photographs, after Montgomery had departed and the journalists had filed their stories, Patton stood alone on a balcony overlooking Messina's harbor. The sun was setting over Sicily, painting the volcanic mountains gold and crimson. Across the strait, Italy waited. The next campaign, the next challenge, the next opportunity to prove himself. Behind him lay 72 miles of coastal road marked by burned-out vehicles and hasty graves. 7,000 American casualties. Boys from farms in Iowa and factories in Detroit, from small Texas towns and Philadelphia neighborhoods who'd believed in their country enough to cross an ocean and fight. Some had made it to Messina. Some hadn't. Patton lit a cigar. The smoke drifted into the Mediterranean evening, dissipating like the day's heat. He'd won his race. He'd beaten Montgomery. He'd proven American forces were second to none in speed and aggression. But wars weren't won by races. They were won by the accumulated weight of men and metal, by industrial capacity and political will, by the willingness of democracies to pay the price of defeating tyranny. One general's ambition, no matter how fulfilled, was just a small part of that larger equation. Still, he'd gotten to Messina first. And sometimes in war as in life, that had to be enough. The lights came on in the city below as darkness fell. American soldiers securing their positions, setting guards, writing letters home if they had paper and light enough to see. Ordinary men doing extraordinary things because their country asked it of them, because evil existed and needed defeating, because someone had to stand in the gap. Patton watched the lights and thought about the road ahead. The invasion of Italy would begin soon, then France, then Germany itself. A long road, measured in miles and months and lives. But tonight, for this one moment, he allowed himself to savor victory. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new opportunities for glory and disaster. Tonight, Messina was his, and history would remember who got there first